So good day, friends. This is Dr. Bob Hamilton, and you have tuned in today to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for being making us part of your day. It means a lot to me. I know that every one of you out there listening are busy people. You have kids, you have grandkids, you have a lot going on in your life. The fact that you tune in for even a short time means a lot to me. And if you like what you hear, hope you do. Pass it on to your friends. Tell your neighbors, people that you know who might be interested. We're trying to build a audience base, and the reason we're doing that is because the people that I bring to you on a weekly basis are truly accomplished, amazing people. And today is a pleasure to welcome one of those individuals, a very accomplished individual. His name is Professor, former professor, but Dr. John Cogan. He is up at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. He's been in government for a long time. He was the Assistant Secretary of Labor under Ronald Reagan, and ultimately was advanced to the Deputy Director of the Office of Management and Budget under President Reagan. And Dr. John Cogan, it's a pleasure to welcome you today to the Hamilton Review.
It's a pleasure to be with you, Bob.
And so we're going to talk about economic issues today, friends. And and the reason why we talk about economic issues frequently on the show is because you guys have got children, you have grandchildren, and ultimately the mess that we make as hopefully adults in this world today, unfortunately, for better or for worse, will be passed on to our children. And there are many, many things that those of you who listen to the show know that I have concerns about the economic policies which are coming out of the government right now. We're going to talk about that in detail. But before we get to that, Dr. Cogan, I'd like to have my guests introduce themselves. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to you. Tell us a little bit about your journey in life and what were the things, the inflection points that brought you to where you're at today.
Well, thank you, Bob. So I was one of 7 children of Joe and Florence Cogan. We was born in New York, early years in New Jersey. We came to Southern California to take advantage of California's great educational system in the 1960s. I went to UCLA, got my PhD from UCLA, came up to Hoover and to Stanford in the late 1970s. And then in 1981, I joined the Reagan administration, as you said, in the Labor Department. Spent 5 years with President Reagan, left and came back to the Hoover Institution and to Stanford, where I've been writing and teaching since the late 1980s.
It's amazing. So you knew Ronald Reagan, you knew President Reagan. What kind of a guy was he?
What a leader. What a leader. If we had him now, we'd be in a lot better shape. He was a man of courage, a man of deep philosophy, and a man of great inspiration. All the things you want in a president, Ronald Reagan was.
Yeah. I met him a couple times, and I have to say that, many people who were detractors of him looked at him as being not an intellectual, but he was really, in fact, very much an intellectual. He was very, very well read. He really knew policy. He was a great leader. And listen, I have great respect for President Reagan. I think he will be looked upon in history as being one of the true great presidents of American history. So you're a fortunate man to have worked with him. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So after President Reagan left office, 2 of my colleagues, Martin Anderson and Annalise Anderson, found in the archives some of his writings on his speeches. Now, most presidents have their own speechwriters that write everything. What you see in Ronald Reagan's archives is speeches that he hand wrote himself, and they're full of intellectual history. They're full of wisdom, great knowledge of public affairs, and those letters and those writings have changed people's view about Ronald Reagan as an intellectual man.
Yeah, I mean, it's actually, I mean, I think everybody out there listening knows this, that a lot of the speeches that presidents give are actually not written by them. They're written by policymakers, they're written by other people, and there's nothing wrong with people writing speeches if you agree with them. But I do think that the fact that he very, very frequently was intimately involved with the actual speeches that he gave. In particular, I'm thinking about the one when he went to Berlin and he said, you know, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. Now, I think you know that the story of that, Dr. Cogan, that his speechwriters looked at that and said, you gotta cross that out. And he kept on putting it back in, right?
That's right. That's right. That's right. He was not led around by his staff. He knew what he wanted and got it.
Yeah, yeah, and the crazy thing was that, you know, he actually, you know, that particular line is the line that we remember from that speech. That was the line that really made, I think, was the beginning of the toppling of the Berlin Wall and ultimately the demise of the then Soviet Union, which was a a real strike, a blow for. A blow against despotism and a real stride toward freedom in the world. And I think that has proven to be true. So fascinating. You're a fortunate man to have had that opportunity to actually work with Mr. Reagan, President Reagan. He was a remarkable guy. So your name came across my my pathway, Dr. Cogan, when I read an article that was published in the Wall Street Journal on January 23rd of this year, 2023, and you talk about the title of the article is "Congress Once Constrained Government Debt." Okay, now I will just say that right now, as a backdrop, and maybe we'll ask this question first. Our national debt has now ballooned up to 31.4 trillion. I'm not even sure I can even comprehend that number. In particular, with the pandemic and some of the spending bills that were introduced under Trump and then continued under President Biden, that debt number has actually ballooned. Can you just say a couple of words before we talk about your article and maybe some of the solutions? Can you talk a little bit about the national debt? I think this is a very important issue. And again, why are we talking about the national debt on a show where we're talking about children? Because ultimately, friends, our children are going to have to deal with our mess. And so, Dr. Cogan, your thoughts?
So we've been running federal budget deficits every year for the last 20 years. And as you said, Bob, where we are now is with a national debt of $31 trillion. We fall into a megabuck syndrome. And a megabuck syndrome is where the number becomes so large that it fails to have any meaning. It's just some abstract thing. Well, again, let me give you a sense about how large that is. Suppose you had a credit card that had an unlimited balance in it. So you're like the federal treasury, and you wish to spend $1,000 a second with your credit card. Every second, $1,000. How long would it take you to spend $1 trillion? A year? 5 years? 6 months? Well, it turns out that it's almost 32 years.
Wow.
So now we have a debt of 31 trillion, right? And so if you wanted to spend 31 trillion at $1,000 a second, you'd have to go back almost 1,000 years, right?
Wow.
So in any event, it's an enormous number. Why should people be concerned about it? Well, economics teaches us that large amounts of public debt eventually cause economic progress to slow.
Yep.
And thereby reducing future standards of living. They cause inflation, and we're experiencing now the first bout of inflation in 40 years. And it's a direct consequence of the excessive spending and Federal Reserve policy during the pandemic and after the pandemic. And at worst, what happens with large amounts of public debt is that we end up in a debt crisis where financial markets freeze up, you end up with chaos and an abrupt, large decline in living standards and large unemployment.
Yeah.
So the consequences of a large amount of debt are very, very serious for that reason. There's one other thing that I want to mention about debt. Just paying interest on the national debt is now consuming 25% of all of our income tax revenue at the federal level.
So let me just make a comment. Okay, 25%. That means that, friends, when you talk about you're paying your bills, okay, every month you pay your bills, and if you have a big MasterCharge bill or MasterCard, whatever, you're paying of the money that you're receiving, 25%. Just imagine that. If you were getting if you're getting $5,000 a month or $10,000 a month, okay, think about 10,000 if you're in that category. $2,500 every month is out the window. That doesn't buy any food. It doesn't pay your mortgage. It does nothing. All it does is it goes out the window. And that's because our national debt is held by people, by governments, by other entities that require that we pay our bills. And by the way, that doesn't, you're saying that's interest, John, that doesn't actually reduce the principal. Is that correct?
That is correct. That's absolutely correct. And so if you think about most people want their tax dollars to go to some beneficial, productive activity, be it caring for the poor, be it education, be it roads and bridges. But a quarter of our tax revenues now, federal income tax revenues, are going just to pay interest to debt. It's going to bankers, it's going to foreign governments, it's going to people that have lent the United States government money. If we don't do anything about the national debt, if we continue along the current trajectory, in 10 years, that percentage will go to 50%. So half of all income tax revenues at that point will be going to pay interest on the national debt. That is to be going to banks, financial houses, and foreign governments and sovereign wealth funds.
So John, this is, when you say that, I literally, my heart skips a beat, because I am thinking about, and again, this is not paying off one penny of the principal. This to me is terrifying, because that number, 50%, I mean, that doesn't fix a bridge. It doesn't pay any money for defensive purposes and the other issues that government is usually responsible to cover. And that to me is incomprehensible, that we're allowing ourselves to head that direction. And I hope that the people who are listening today have the same kind of sense of worry, because this, if it doesn't impact you personally, and I think it will for many listening, you're going to be around in 10 years, it's definitely going to affect our children. And as a pediatrician, I look at, Dr. Cogan, I have to say, when I look at children in my office every day, I sometimes let my mind wander, and I look at this beautiful little baby boy, baby girl, and I sometimes wonder, who are they going to be when they're an adult? Where are they going to go? What countries are they going to travel to? What will be their life mission? Who are they going to marry? Are they going to have children? I think about that, because I think that's a good thing for pediatricians to think about. And I do. And I have to say, I want to, as much as I can, certainly for my children and my grandchildren, I want to pass on to them a better world. And I guess that one of my passions at this point, and people, economists like you and public policy people like you, make it clear to me that this is something that may not be happening. And that's why I bring people like you on my show.
Well, it's a challenge unlike any other that the United States has had. We've had large deficits during war times, and we've had large deficits during economic recessions. And the Great Depression is a good example of when we've had large deficits. But they've never been permanent deficits. They've always been sort of cyclical deficits. This deficit that we have now and the building up of the national debt is a permanent phenomenon unless we take action to either restrain government spending or raise taxes. Now, my own view, Bob, on the cause of these deficits is that it's too much spending, not too little revenue. And a good example is just last year. Last year, the government's tax revenues were the second highest level relative to the national income in the nation's history, peacetime history. At only one other point in our history after World War II have taxes as a percentage of GDP or national income been higher. And yet we still ran a $1.4 trillion deficit. That is, we spent all of those revenues and then went out and borrowed another $1.4 trillion.
Yeah. Wow.
And so our problem here is a problem of too much spending, not too little revenue. If you wanted to just close the current deficit by raising taxes, you could tax the top 1% of Americans of 100% on their income. That is, take all of their income, and it would maybe cover about 2/3 of the current deficit. And therefore, the national debt would continue to grow. So no amount of tax increases are going to help us solve this problem. We've got to restrain spending.
And I think that right now, the top couple percent of the earners are paying by far the majority of taxes right now. But if people always go, well, tax the rich, well, if you take everything from those who are considered rich, by the way, there are a lot of you listening out there who make six-figure incomes. Well, you are considered rich in the eyes of politicians. I want you to know that. And if you feel rich, God bless you. Most of the people I know who are making six-figure incomes right now are feeling actually pretty poor, or at least don't seem to have enough money or they feel like they're not getting ahead. But anyway, just know that when they talk about taxing the rich, it depends on what bucket you kind of find yourself in. I sometimes chuckle about that, because I'm considered in that category. I don't feel that way at all. Certainly, I don't feel that way on April 15th. I can tell you that. Okay. Well, John, listen, we're going to take a 1-minute break. I want to get into the article that you wrote for the Journal, because I think that friends, there is a little bit of hope here. And I want Dr. Cogan to really talk about that hope. And so, friends, don't go away. You're listening to Hamilton Review. We're having a great conversation with Dr. John Cogan up there at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, and we will be right back.
The Hamilton Review podcast is brought to you by Hamilton Babies, 9 kid-friendly products designed for the little loves in your life. Find them at hamiltonbabies.com or amazon.com. Also consider Dr. Hamilton's recently published book, 7 Secrets of the Newborn, available at Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, and amazon.com.
So, friends, welcome back to the Hamilton Review. We're continuing our conversation with Dr. John Cogan. He is the former deputy director of the Office of Management and Budget under the Reagan administration. Now he's up at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. And John, we're going to get into this article that you wrote in January for the Journal. I want to read a little bit from it, because you start out with mentioning the national debt of $31 trillion. But you mentioned that the political will to cut spending, and I'm quoting this article, friends, is hard to muster. Congressional history shows that the budget process itself creates incentives for excessive spending and budget deficits. This is an important paragraph here. Entitlement programs have accounted for all the growth in federal spending relative to gross domestic product in the past 60 years, causing the persistent budget deficits during that period. Entitlement expenditures, and John, you can kind of clarify what that is in a second here, are determined differently from so-called discretionary programs. Spending on the latter programs is set by fixed appropriations of money. Entitlement expenditures, however, aren't fixed in advance, but determined by the program's level of benefits, its eligibility rules, and economic factors. So I think it's important to really differentiate between what entitlements are and what other discretionary programs are. So, John, I'm going to let you explain that to our listeners today.
So great. So, Bob, entitlement programs give people a legal right to benefits so long as they meet some specified eligibility rules. And so the amount of spending that occurs in any year on entitlement programs depends upon how many people become eligible for the program, what the level of benefits are, and both of those end up being determined by the performance of the economy. So they're not known in advance. So the next time you hear that Congress actually votes on a budget, know that that is an incorrect statement. As you said, Bob, entitlements account for about 2/3 of all government spending. Those entitlements go from one year to the next without any further action by Congress. And so Congress only votes on 1/3 of the budget. The rest of it is on automatic pilot through these entitlements. So what are these entitlement programs? Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Affordable Care Act subsidies, a raft of cash assistance under welfare programs, disability payments. So all of these programs that are entitlements are very sensitive, politically sensitive programs that provide very important levels of assistance to individuals.
Yep.
They're part of a safety net that any modern developed country has. They're part of a compassionate society. But in our system, they've gone way out of control. And why do I say that? Well, only about 20% of all of the entitlement programs expenditures go to individuals to reduce poverty. About $800 billion a year go to individuals that are in the upper half of the income distribution.
Wow.
So the original purposes of these entitlements was really, you remember, to provide a measure of economic security for individuals in old age, to provide a safety net so people wouldn't fall into poverty through no fault of their own, right? And so that's what they've grown into something that's completely different. One of the reasons that they've grown this to be so large, I think, is the budget process. The budget process creates these incentives for Congress to spend more and more and not to retrench on spending at all. Doesn't mean that politics aren't important. Obviously, the difficulty we see now in even talking about entitlements reveals the political difficulties. But I do believe that the process that Congress follows in making decisions on spending is really an important part of the problem. So why do I say that? Well, within Congress, each of these entitlement programs is under the jurisdiction of a different committee. And so within Congress now, you have about a dozen committees in the House and another dozen in the Senate that have jurisdiction over some part of the budget that spends money.
Yep.
In this kind of system, it creates what we call in economics a tragedy of the commons, okay? And the way a tragedy of the commons works, let me use two examples. The first one is, imagine you had a communally owned forest, publicly owned forest, and you allowed a dozen or 24 logging companies to have access to that forest. None of those logging companies would have any incentive to restrain their harvesting of trees. In fact, every one of them would try to harvest as many trees as they could before another company came in and harvested those trees.
Right.
And so in a commons, competition leads to overconsumption or overproduction, and eventually that forest would soon be depleted of trees. Situation is no different in Congress. The common resource or common pool here is federal revenues, and the committees are consumers of those revenues. So when each committee meets, it decides, should I cut back on the programs that are in my jurisdiction? Should I, if I'm the ag committee, should I cut back on farm price supports? And the answer is, well, if I do and nobody else goes along on their programs, the deficit is unaffected, and I have worked to the disadvantage of the people that benefit from my program.
Your constituency. Yeah.
And so no committee has any incentive to constrain its spending unless every other committee goes along with it. And every committee has an incentive to spend as much as they can before every other committee spends. And so one difference between the logging example and Congress is that in the logging example, when the forest is denuded of trees, things end. With Congress, once they blow through the available revenues, they continue to spend and they borrow. And that's why we have deficits.
That's where the deficit comes from. So I know for a fact that this is not anything new. In the 19th century, you give an example in your article that you wrote about what was going on then. And can you kind of pick it up there?
Yes. So back in the 19th century, budgets were balanced for the most part. We ran deficits during wars and during economic recessions, but otherwise budgets were balanced. For the vast majority of the 19th century, one single committee in each house was responsible for spending. So we didn't have this tragedy of the commons. Congress figured out early on that the only way to get control over spending was to have a single committee responsible for the total, and that single committee could make the trade-offs necessary to keep spending within a fixed total. In the 1880s, Congress experimented with an alternative approach. They splintered or dispersed committee jurisdiction over spending to 8 additional committees. So now you created a commons problem in the Congress. What did we see? We saw deficits that were more frequent and larger than at any time in history. In fact, during the debate in the 1880s over this proposal to splinter committee jurisdiction, the former Speaker of the House stood up and he warned Congress that this was a huge mistake. He said, if you undertake to divide these appropriations and create many committees where there ought to be but one, you will enter upon a path of extravagance you cannot foresee the length of or the depth of until the treasury of the country is bankrupt. And as I said, we started running deficits that were unprecedented in their frequency and unprecedented in their magnitude after that.
Yeah.
But then after World War I, Congress realized it had a huge problem on its hands and took action to fix the problem. In what would today you would think would be impossible, Congress stripped spending jurisdiction from more than a half a dozen committees and lodged that spending authority back into the Appropriations Committee. Both the House did it and the Senate did it in 1921.
Wow.
So we had a single committee responsible for spending all through the 1920s, and we had balanced budgets all the way through the 1920s up to the Great Depression. And then in the 1930s, we started creating these entitlement programs, and each entitlement was parceled out to a different committee. And so over time, we created another tragedy of the commons within Congress. And I do believe that that is the fundamental problem within the Congress.
Yes. And so your recommendation basically is very clear. You're saying, hey, listen, we need to reckon with this situation of the commons. Great example, by the way. I could visualize. I'm from Northern California, and I know what big forests look like, and they would be denuded over and overnight, really. But so your recommendation is we need to reinstate an authorization committee, an appropriation committee that would at least have some kind of oversight. How do John, one of the, when you think about Social Security and Medicare and different things, Medicaid, what is happening right now in France, Macron, as you probably are well aware, is trying to inch up the time of retirement there in France from 62 to 64, and he's having incredible blowback. Are there things that we can tweak in this country that would actually maybe delay benefits to people? Thoughts about that that you have?
Yes, I do. Most people think that Social Security benefits are the same from one group to another group over time, adjusted for inflation. But that's not so. It turns out that Social Security promises higher benefits to future retirees than the benefits that are provided to today's retirees, even after you've adjusted for inflation. So the real purchasing power of future Social Security, future Social Security benefits is higher than the benefits that are provided to today's retirees. Same thing is true with Medicare. And so if what we did was just simply said, look, for the future, Social Security benefits to future retirees are going to be the same in real terms as the benefits that are paid to today's retirees. And Medicare benefits are going to grow only at the rate of the medical price inflation. We would solve about 70% of our budget problem. That is, we would get very close to slowing the growth in the national debt to just a marginal level. And so I've always felt, you put it in terms of tweaks or small changes, I've always felt that small changes in benefits on these entitlement programs can have a huge effect ultimately on the trajectory of government spending.
The big question is, do politicians have the courage and the vision and the foresight to do this?
Yes, that's exactly right. We go back to our opening discussion about Ronald Reagan. We are sorely in need of leadership that has courage, and that I think is what we're lacking in the system.
Yeah,
I think Woodrow Wilson put it right though with respect to the process. Woodrow Wilson said, without budget reform in the sense of consolidating all spending authority back into a single committee, he said, without that reform, spending control is impossible. Yep. And so I think there are two sides to this. One is the political side and getting leadership and making people understand that you're not going to be tearing up the social safety net in order to make these programs solvent for the future.
I don't think
the process.
Yeah, I don't think we want to do that. I think we first of all, there are a lot of people who paid in Social Security for their entire, lifetime of working. And I think there has to be some kind of, payback there. At the same time, we're bankrupting a country, and I certainly don't want us to look like Greece or Argentina anytime in the future. And this is something, we talk about institutions or entities, quote, too large to fail. I think that is a incredible fallacy, because nothing is too large to fail. And you just have to kind of begin to go through your history books and see things that look like they were too large to fail, and they failed. Right. So this is something that we need to all take to heart and concern ourselves about, because economic issues really drive, as some people say, and I sometimes say this, that money makes the world go round. It kind of does. Certainly when it comes to governments, that's for sure.
Yeah, yes, I think so. On Social Security and Medicare, very, very tough, because people have paid into those programs and they should get back what they've paid in. And so I think therein lies part of our problem, is that we've promised way too much. And many people are getting, through Medicare especially, much more than they paid in to the system. But, that's a deep question of fairness. But I do think that if we really want these programs to be there for the future, because both Medicare and Social Security are on a certain track to bankruptcy. If we want them to be there for the future, we've got to do something about the future benefits. The political system will not and probably should not touch the benefits of those people that are on the rolls now. Yeah. But for future people that are going to be getting promised higher benefits, I think we need to be able to have a reasonable adult conversation about how we might slow the growth in those benefits.
Well, Dr. Cogan, you have been a wealth of information and wisdom, and I want to thank you for taking the time to be on the Hamilton Review today. Friends, the subtitle of my show is "Where Kids and Culture Collide." Let me just say again that the future economic situation, if we don't make some kind of reforms, there's going to be a major collision, and the people who are going to have to deal with it as your children age and get older, they're the ones who are going to have to look at what we are doing right now, and they're going to shake their heads and say, "Why did they do this?" And we do need to make those kind of reforms and think about that when we go to the polls, and just how we live our lives in general. So, Dr. Cogan, thank you very much for being on the Hamilton Review.
Well, thank you for having me, Bob. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. And friends, you have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Until next time, be well, be safe. We'll see you then. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to the Hamilton Review, where kids and culture collide. Thank you for allowing us to be a part of your day. Tune in again next week on Apple Podcast. Rate and comment and tell a friend.